delighted one. I mean, really, you have no idea how wonderful it is to have somebody send you an airline ticket from Denver to Sydney, Australia. It's fabulous. Especially there was like 7 inches of snow on the ground when I left, you know, so. It's just so fantastic to be here and to be in a group of women and men who care about these issues. And the one thing that Tricia, in her kindness, just been a fabulous minder of me, didn't say is that I'm angry about what's been happening. I am so just up to here with the neglect of gender issues and the neglect of women's issues in disaster recovery when we know so much and when women have lost so much in these events. So I'm a bit of a crusader, and I'm sorry my voice will be rising as I go, but truly, my entry to this came many, many years ago, and I'm still hot under the collar about it. So I stumbled into disaster sociology as kind of an accidental sociologist when Hurricane Andrew came to the neighborhood where we had just bought what we thought was the perfect house with the palm trees, and you know we'd just been relocated. Partner's a geologist. He actually was, get this, in Kalgoorlie looking for gold at the time, and the boys and I were at home in Miami in this brand new house in a brand new environment, and they kept trying to warn us that there was a cyclone coming, but I was clueless. I had no idea what a cyclone, what actually did that mean, but I did take a bungee cord and put the lid on the top of my garbage can in preparation for the event. So we lost the house, and more to the point, of course, you know what it feels like to lose the environment, to lose the neighborhood, to lose the city, to lose your sense of place, and to lose if you will, the warp and weave of your life for a while. So that did plunge me personally, but also academically and intellectually into trying to sort out what does it mean? What is a disaster, and how does it affect our communities? And particularly, how are women, first of all, I began to asking how are women impacted, but now more recently asking myself and learning from women around the world, how are women responding? You know, how can we begin to build what could be a resilient, safer, just society without women? And I put it to you, I think you would agree, it's impossible, right? So the question really has to be, how can we capitalize on women's knowledge and women's learning? So again, thank you for coming and for being here to share your ideas. I hope some of you will agree to be recorded, because I have to tell you, the repository of women's recorded voices is so small, and it's such an important knowledge base that if you can contribute or write a story or write a poem or somehow or other document what you've been through, what you've learned, it would be fabulous, really. So as Tricia said, I'm a field researcher. I've studied in the United States and Canada, in India and Indonesia, and various different places, but I think the common thread, the threads that I'll be discussing today are quite common, but correct me if I'm wrong, if there are things that you'd like to raise that are a little bit different. I'll kind of race through some of these sort of talky slides, and then we have some photos that I do love, but this is what I'd like to talk with you about. Am I like right in the way of people here? No? Good to go? Okay. So in 30 quick minutes, a few of those things, but just to make the point that really we don't know an awful lot about gender, but the people who make movies and cartoons and art and write the newspaper articles think that they know an awful lot about gender. Mainly they think that women panic. Actually, we think that all people panic in disasters, but women in particular are immobilized by our strong emotions, and that we're passive observers of the scene, awaiting help, right, awaiting rescue, as I said, immobilized by that. And that is so not true, but very pervasive in our popular culture. We've learned a lot. I'm a student really of disasters, and if you read enough disaster studies, you really become disenchanted with the command and control notion. And you have to understand that disasters are fundamentally human events. They're uncontrollable in their essence, right? We create them, we live through them. Each one bubbles up differently and resolves itself differently, but these are some of the characteristics of it. They're complex social events, they're multidimensional, they have all these different facets. They are, yeah, as I said, they're political, and they are always contested. I'm sure we could spend the entire day talking about the politics of disaster recovery in this area, right? Yeah. And they're highly gendered, so that's what I'd like to just focus on that point. And of course, we know that gender matters because gender is a central organizing principle of every society. And you know that. I think in this group, I won't belabor that point. We want to differentiate between sex and sexualities and genders and men's and masculinities and dominant femininities. We don't have time to really look at the fine-grained perspective here, but gender matters in these ways. It puts people in different places throughout the day, in different hazard contexts, brings people to these really horrific events with a different sense of yourself, of your capacities, a sense of different relationships with people, different access to resources, and different control over resources. So gender, of course, situations vary differently. It also, I want to make the point, it also shapes the culture of our work in the health professions and particularly in disaster management as well. So while it's often dismissed, minimized, trivialized, reduced to stereotypes about women or men. It's extremely important and under-investigated. I was saying to Tricia that another way to speak about this sometimes is just to listen to the words of women. And again, I've said before, there are not that many, but this is a statement that I thought you might appreciate, because one of my very favorite ones about the impacts, we won't be talking too much about the impacts, but about the impacts of loss, of this disaster. This is a friend of mine who's an anthropologist who lost her home, and I think it was 185 of her neighbors in a horrific fire in Berkeley, 1994, I think it was. And I won't read all of it, but just to focus on a little bit of her words here. She says, "I had no salt. By this I mean I had no salt to put upon my food, and also I had no salt left for tears. I had no thread. By this I mean I had no thread to stitch my daughter's hem, and also I lost the thread of my life. The pattern of my days, my plans, my routines were irrevocably ruptured, the warp of my past torn from the weave of my future." And she talks about losing her numbers, losing her vita, losing the connections, losing the equations, had no paper, no sheets, no warm woolly sweater, no lights. By this I mean no light bulbs, no work lamp, no flashlight, candles, matches, but also no lightness, no joy crept into my days for a lengthy while. And I would just like to acknowledge what you all have been through and what women and men and their families are going through right now around the world and right next door to us, right? What is it? 800, no, how many thousands of people being evacuated as we speak? 8,000, that's what I thought. They're going through a lot, and you know what they're going through. So there's a lot at stake, a lot to appreciate, and if we had more time, we might want to talk more about impacts and about how women respond or intervene in different ways at different levels, professionally, in the community, in the family. But I'd like to focus today on recovery for several different reasons. One is that recovery planning is the one that falls off the desk all the time. We focus more on disaster management, and I'm a professor of disaster management as well, on the response and the preparedness phase, right? But when it comes to recovery, we often kind of think it'll just fall into place, right? And that's the missed opportunity to capitalize on that loss, and as we say, to build back better, to try and build resilience into how we recover. But we really, in order to do that correctly, have to understand that disasters are not equal opportunity levelers, right? They will affect us differently. As I said, we have different resources. And we also think about loss and recovery in the future differently. We have different relationships to the land. So we can't just take a one-size-fits-all approach to recovery or to anything else. And that last point is important as well. Women and men don't mobilize equally or in the same kinds of ways or the same venues with the same significance after disasters, and that's an important thing. So there's a lot to learn. We do know some of these things that, again, are common threads, that some of the things that women do are, looking at the photograph on the top, that we touch each other's hearts, right? We touch physically, we touch emotionally, we make those connections that are so essential after, they are essential, you know, that we help others, we help ourselves by helping others, we share, we advocate and organize, and if somebody has to go out there and sort through the piles of relief goods to make sure the kids have some clothes tomorrow, it's going to be the moms and the grandmothers and the sisters more often. We mobilize also for equity and for interpreting disasters in ways that are meaningful to women, and women, of course, are half of the world's population, so that's a many different kinds of interpretations that different women, differently situated, bring. There's a lot there. The picture at the bottom I love because it's a picture from Iowa of flooded women, and these were apparently the best cooks in the region. They had just been to the kitchen and made a whole lot of food for the front responders, and I have a feeling a number of you might have also been cooking up a storm as well. That's one of the things that's undervalued. Well, what supports women in this work of yours, of ours, really? These are some of the things that I think that we need, and I'll return to this kind of level of discussion a little bit later. But fundamentally, women need to be heard, right? Absolutely need to be heard. Listened to, heard, and those ideas acted on. And that means not every woman equally. That means in particular those who are on the front lines, in the eye of the storm, if you will. And then, of course, we need to figure out how to care for the caregivers. We've had that conversation going a long time in most of our countries. We need to have that kind of economic support that makes it possible for women to get back up and going. One of the most astounding interviews I did in Grand Forks was with people from the Chamber of Commerce who were surprised when they were able to open the banks again, and then they couldn't get workers to come. Because women were not able to get childcare, so they weren't able to come. So it didn't really do much good to prioritize opening up financial institutions without understanding the gender story behind that. So women need that economic support, need that focused outreach, the sharing, and we really need the resilient women's organizations. It's so sad to interview, for example, crisis workers in Grand Forks again, who really want to be there for the women in shelter, the women they've been counseling, the women they're concerned about their safety, and they can't even get to their own building, right? Their computers are go down. There was no planning. The water that they thought would be 2 feet was, over the top of the roof of the building. So the organizations themselves that are lifelines for women to respond and to recover are often devastated through lack of planning. We're talking more on Friday about those issues. I think some of you may be able to come and join us in that conversation as well. We definitely need more help for men, because men, of course, are impacted in multiple ways, and some of them relating directly to gender. So it's a very important and underexplored topic in policy and in research, but I put it today to the side because I'd like to focus, International Women's Day, on women, but noting the fact that we have to do more work in here. And also in a self-interested way, because one of the real challenges for women is to respond to the men and the boys and what they are going through, right? It complicates enormously. None of us live alone, right? That's not true, but I mean, you know what I mean? That metaphorically we're all connected, and so the men in our lives matter enormously to us in many different ways, and we need to focus more on that as well. But let me just, now that I'm using half my time already, wrap it forward, yes? That gender-responsive recovery planning is essential for these reasons that I think I've just spoken to. But when I look at how we're approaching this now, I see at least these 5 gaps. So you can think of these negatively or positively, ways that we might begin to move recovery planning, disaster recovery planning in offices all over the world. It's going on in little baby steps usually. And women and men and gender relations are not yet fully incorporated. So we're not using gender analysis, a fundamental, analytic tool of most good public policy and health policy and education, but not used in disaster management. We're not looking back and seeing what are the lessons that we might have learned from the tsunami, from the last floods, from your great-grandmothers, right? From the women who were flooded in North Dakota as well. We're divorcing gender from everything else that makes it meaningful, from culture, from history, right? We're not also anticipating what's happening in the future. When you think about the recovery, what would be the different opportunities for women and men? If you rebuild, as in New Orleans, focusing on bringing the casinos back in, you're recreating the economic vulnerabilities of women. Because where do women work in casinos? At the bottom. Oh, and it actually broke the glass too. Oh, so sorry. Did it get to your?
No.
Well, that's the first. I don't think I've ever. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Well, I was just getting aggravated about those casinos, right? And finally, also because we don't positively engage with women, we effectively disempower women, the very people we need most to do mitigation, to do preparedness, to get us through the next disaster, because, as you know, this is our future, right? Disasters are not something that we're going to see fewer of, but more and more of, with climate change, with the social vulnerabilities of the way we're building our cities and constructing our life. Disasters are fundamentally choices, and we have made choices as societies around the world that put us more at risk rather than less at risk. So we're now in the midst of it. Well, I think, again, I won't belabor these points, but just to briefly show some examples. So I've said that we don't use the tools that we have. We really need sex-specific data in order to do any kind of recovery planning. You have to know what would be the mental health needs of people. Well, they're different if you're a young adolescent boy or a young adolescent girl. So we need gender-specific or sex-specific data there. We need to have women involved in making those kind of social maps, those risk assessments, which engage people in conversations about the strengths of your community, the resources, the skills, the talents, all the things that you've learned, as well as the vulnerabilities. What's going to put some women more at risk than others in your own community. We need, again, to look back and to understand the historical lens, as I said, what we've learned from past, but also what you can learn from elders and how people's relationships, gender relationships included, changed during the life course. Right? The relationship between women and men have been together for many years. I'm 42 years with the same man. It changes, right? I mean, the life is long, and so we have to have a historical perspective also on what gender means in terms of disasters. We have to look at how women's movements have changed. Again, this notion of context, that here's a fellow who's lost his partner in the Sichuan earthquake, and for him to be a father or a man who's bereft of an only child in China means something different than it might be for a father who's lost a child in my country or in yours, right? Because of the culture there. Just one small example. And we lack foresight. Again, I love this picture. This is a woman in a shelter in New Orleans, and she's pissed. Is she not? She is angry. She's not just concerned. She's a single mother, arguably, responsible for that baby, and she's in a shelter that doesn't provide safe space for breastfeeding, for child care facilities, for a safe space for women to get together and talk about the risks that they may feel, or just to share ideas about what comes next and how to get out of there, how to get housing. If you've been in a relief center, you know it's a muddle. Everything needs to be sorted out, and sometimes we've learned internationally to have a women's space is a lifesaver, and there was none of that. Lack of foresight, lack of engagement with women. I guess I put this picture here and contend that the care and the loving physical and emotional connections that she makes with her children is absolutely invaluable, cannot be bought, and we can't take it for granted. It won't always be there. Women are not an endless giving. We can't continue to do it without kind of support, without nurturance, without feeling cared for ourselves, right? So lack of engagement is also, and we have to really build on what she is offering through sustained engagement. Well, I've presented some sort of other issues that I think are before us, and again, just focusing on recovery, which, as you know, is a long-term process. It's multifaceted. It's got lots of ups and downs, and I hope we can talk more informally later about where you are and how you're feeling about that as people who were directly and indirectly affected. There's never anybody in a community like this who's not affected one way or another. But it's a very long process, is it not? And actually, one of the things we talk about in the classroom is, when does one disaster end? What is the end point of a disaster? Arguably, in our present world, there isn't one, right? The end of one fire season is like the beginning of the next fire season, and that becomes part of our daily living. And so it behooves us really to bring risk reduction, not just emergency response. How are we going to have the relief centers organized, right? But risk reduction as part and parcel of everything we do in schools, in our homes, in every organization, certainly in our social service organizations, and in our disaster management organizations. But we don't so far. However, let's look at what women are doing, because I think if you just kind of step out of the formal realm of practice of disaster management, there's a lot to be encouraged about. Some really positive learnings. And I'm so pleased, I have to stop and say that we are putting some of this work here in Australia on film, and again, I hope that some of you will speak quietly to the camera a little bit later, because that builds this knowledge base that we are so lacking without stopping to record it and to document it. And then I can share what's happening here, which is very important. And again, hats off to Women's Health for doing this long-term initiative, right? That's quite unique. Nothing like this in the United States, nothing like this in Canada, nothing like this in New Zealand or the United Kingdom, to my knowledge, at all. So just some pictures just to make some of these points a little more concrete. These are the women that we did a wonderful project called Working with Women at Risk. It's a template for working with this is going to move without me telling it to move, because it shouldn't. And maybe I just accidentally hit it. We'll see. This is working with women at risk in the Caribbean. These are women in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. We worked there, and in Dominica and El Salvador and St. Lucia, really trying to develop a way, kind of you might look at it as a training manual, but it really is a way of bringing women together to do this grassroots planning. But the neat thing about it was that it resulted in a short community profile, short, right? And then the women were able to take it to the local municipal authorities and have a community dialogue around it. And then the intended next step was to have the women become peer educators, community environmental educators, if you will, around risk in the neighboring villages. But, it was a grant-funded project. I think you've been on that road before. And when the funds ended, that project ended at that point. But it was an important thing, and the women will tell you how much they enjoyed just engaging in that collectively today. Women are also, this is a picture from Cuba. You may be aware that Cuba has very, very low fatality rates in their horrific storms, partly because of the social organization of their society, but also because they take preparedness seriously, and they engage older women in particular in door-to-door household preparation. They will go and knock on every single door when they need to evacuate, and they get people out of harm's way. They're a very poor country, but they have managed to transcend that through really good public awareness and preparedness and good relief centers, so they don't have that same, they don't have to spend all their money, putting things back together again. So that door-to-door work that women do is important. There's a little picture from West Africa about the community radio stations. And in many cultures, you'll find that that is the main avenue of communication between women. Are women-run, women-powered, volunteer community radio stations. There's another example from, where's it based? It's in Brazil, FIRE. You may have heard Feminist Radio Endeavor or something or other. There's an acronym there. And they, for example, have done telenovelas also around risk reduction, around flooding, as a matter of fact, right? And they build that onto their radio station. You can tune in for weekly episodes of how to respond to the flood, how to prepare for it, by listening to the story that unfolds. And I think that's something that we might take on board somehow, to think about more creative ways that women can communicate amongst ourselves. And perhaps community radio is one. You'll have to tell me, maybe social media, maybe Twitter is the way of the future. I'm always on the conservative side of that, but often wrong. So maybe the new social media really are the way to go. A similar story, this is a group of women involved in a focus group in Mozambique, developing a telenovela there that's around a soccer team, and that again wove themes around preparedness for drought, I think was the issue there. And they also wove in anti-violence, kind of violence prevention messages there. And what I liked about it is that they developed these telenovelas with input from women. So this is a women and men together in the local community saying, what is the story? What is the storyline? What can we say? These lovely young girls, can you see in the back it says, girls only if you please, on the back. I was just able to spend the summer as a visiting scholar at this small university in South Africa. These young girls live in absolutely horrific township conditions with no sanitation, no public utilities, no nothing, but come out of that with a smile and a passion, every morning. It's incredible. And they're involved in a program called Girls in Risk Reduction Leadership. So they are the future generation, basically. They're doing what we might call it the Girl Scout, Girl Guides kind of activities, a couple hours a week, every afternoon, or 1 or 2 afternoons a week. But they come out of there with a better sense of what the risks are around fire, for example, in their own communities, and how to put out a fire with a propane fire versus a regular, like a wood fire. And more to the point, they're really getting a sense of themselves as actors in their own communities. They're just a fabulous group of people. And, of course, we have the traditional kind of disaster recovery aid, and I know there are a lot of fathers out there who know how to make Kool-Aid too, but I just always think there's a mom behind this little story. One of the things we do. This is a collective picture of women in 7 different countries, a collective called Disaster Watch, but it's organized by GROOTS, which is an acronym, the grassroots women organizing together in sisterhood, GROOTS. And you can Google that, or you'll find in the resources that I think we provided links to that, because their notion was that after a major earthquake in India, that if women could just share the hard-won knowledge, the learnings of that with other women, you can fast forward through a lot of the grief and the pain and the unnecessary loss and delay. And it doesn't, it's not too Pollyannish to think that you can resolve all those problems, but they did send a team of women there to Turkey at the next earthquake, and then again to Iran. They've now gone, I think, 6 or 7 different sites. And they share ideas, for example, around the importance of being on top of the risk of increased violence, about working to make sure that women are included in the economic recovery programs, right? So women who are affected both directly and indirectly, who may work in a different part of the labor force. So if you target, as happened in the tsunami, the fishermen whose boats were destroyed, and you don't target the marketing women, the women who clean the fish and sell it, then you are excluding women from economic recovery without even knowing it, unless you've done that gender analysis. So they're a very proactive group, and I totally recommend their work to you. Many more women engaging in formal initiatives to become disaster risk managers in Pakistan. I think it's noteworthy. There are not a lot of pictures like that from my country. And I don't know about Australia, but I'm thinking not too many pictures of the disaster risk management courses run for women, and here we have it in Pakistan. Also from India, of course, part of recovery is being able to meet immediate needs, and you have many more women moving into the public sector now, understanding that women and men are the first responders in all of our communities. They are the ones who meet immediate needs, right? We don't wait for people in uniforms to come. But it's important to have those skills, and sometimes women have less access to the public space than men, and so this is an initiative to make sure that they have some skills and the confidence and the social space to be the rescuers themselves. We've learned also, this is a picture from India as well, that it's important to work through women's networks and groups to distribute the relief resources, partly because women in our own communities know who will use those resources wisely and who needs them most, right? And how you can most effectively do this. So It's a good example of how sometimes emergency managers feel put upon when you want to talk about gender. They do when they meet me anyway. So one more thing I have to worry about. Please, you don't understand. We have to first get people water and shelter and come later, maybe next year or 2 years from now, we can talk about gender. No, it's a good example of how if we get it right from the beginning and we understand, who actually is going to be just fine down the end of the road and who's not, who actually will not make it through without being there. And I think women's groups, again, because we're closer to the ground, if you will, right? And because so many women work in health fields and are aware of issues like violence, like the threat to women's land in disasters, that if you distribute relief through these networks of ours, you get more, if you will, bang for the buck. So the Sisters on the Planet, you may very, very well be aware of Oxfam Australia's major campaign around climate change, which has really documented some of the differences in developing and developed countries, including drought here in Australia. Have you seen the little snippets there that they have prepared from Australia? We should show that sometime. Yeah, right. And there's one also from Miami. Yeah, they're really lovely. And conversely, from the other side, this is a picture of the very well-heeled group called Women of the Storm in Miami. And look for the forthcoming book, because my co-editor of this book on the women of Katrina, actually, this was his dissertation topic. He was able to gain entree to this group of very elite women in Miami. And they were angry, honest to Pete. I mean, this was, if you remember, it's a number of years ago, but it's as if it were tomorrow for us. And I think you'll be feeling the same. These things stay with you for a long, long, long time. And our representatives hadn't even bothered to get on a bus or to come on down to New Orleans to see what had happened. They sat up in Washington, D.C., right? So these women flew up, affluent women, right, in their best clothes, in their suits, and it's funny, they deliberately took on the kind of demeanor, the symbolism of the Southern genteel woman. So they wore gloves. After they came back home, they wrote handwritten notes and saying, thank you for coming, right? And they always wore blue umbrellas, which has a lot of symbolism, again, in the South. And they really did use their resources, their skills, to lobby for that representation, for real representation for the community. And it worked. They did come down. I wouldn't say that it worked in the long run, but at least they came to see. And now they've moved a little bit on. They're looking at larger issues around the BP oil spill. So it's a network of women that have had quite a bit of impact. At a different level here, you have women who are very courageously speaking out. She's testifying actually about the threat to her land loss is a huge issue. This is from Bangladesh, right? The threat to her ability to stay on this land that so often you find it after a disaster, and you find it after the Indonesian disaster, you'll find it in Japan, I'm sure too, that male relatives come in or large landowners come in and want to take away that land when nobody's looking, and where women often do not have formal documentation, formal deed. So she was testifying about that. This is a project that comes from Eve Ensler's Global Violence Against Women campaign, and you may have seen the Vagina Monologue shows. Maybe they've come to Australia, I would imagine. She takes vignettes about women and how we feel about our bodies and represents them with particular emphasis on violence prevention through these monologues called Vagina Monologues. And here she went to New Orleans and interviewed women about what their experiences were and integrated that into her work. There are a number of kind of cultural interpretations with this kind of same theme around what happened in New Orleans now, including a wonderful play called Swimming Upstream, just verbatim women speaking their stories, and then they're represented dramatically on the screen. I hope we can do more of that here. This is a wonderful project from Banda Aceh after that storm, the tsunami there. UNIFEM, if you remember UNIFEM before it got folded into UN Women, was very proactive, and their concern, and I think it was well warranted, was that recovery planning was going full steam ahead with absolutely no attention to women. So there was this 5-year global lessons learned from the tsunami report coming out, and they brought me along to be sure that there was at least one person who could add a little bit of gender analysis to this report. And so they were able really graciously to have me interview people in 4 or 5 of the countries that were affected. But this is one of the places that I visited, and these women were rebuilding women's houses. So Indonesia, unlike our countries, has a sense that there needs to be a women's center, a women's space in every small village. But it hadn't been a priority for rebuilding, so they were just languishing, and therefore women had no place to go and no safe place to be and no place to meet with the kids. So they were brought together in the second Achenese All Women's World Congress. 250 women, as I recall, came together with a series of different demands and testimonies. And one of the things they wanted to do was to move the rebuilding of the women's centers up higher onto the list of priorities. So they were succeeded in doing that, and then they were actively engaged in redesigning those centers. So women had a chance to think, okay, that's how we used to use our space. How would we like to use it in the future? They were also brought into the technical, the physical rebuilding, as you see here, of these spaces. Really neat story. And they were so proud, so happy, as you can imagine, to have that space again and to have been involved. I think we saw something like that yesterday in your community as well. There was a rebuilding of the center there, and there's a lot of pride taken in that. Firefoxes I have not yet met, but maybe not today. Yeah? Hello, hello. Hi. I love your work, I love your picture, and I use it as an example again of women's emergent post-disaster organizations. So women and men mobilize differently around these events, but women are always on the front lines because recognizing the need, recognizing that gap, and bringing women together again. And so it's wonderful to be here, and I hope to maybe learn a little bit more about your work while I'm here. These are women in a group called Self-Employed Women's Association in India. It's actually a union for women in the informal sector, which in India is like 90% of everybody, right? And women in particular. This has a mind of its own. And they're doing a leadership development training program. And again, I put this as a recovery slide because without that kind of pre-development, community development, women's empowerment, training, and capacity building, right, then women are silenced afterwards. So anything that we do as feminists or as gender equality workers or as health outreach promotion workers that makes women stronger in their own skin, right? And easier to stand up and speak in the is a way of doing recovery work, and we can do that every single day. A program that comes from Nicaragua, where social health workers, mental health workers, after a major hurricane there, took advantage of bringing women and men together in focus groups around mental health recovery to talk about violence. So this means violence against women is one disaster men can prevent. Is that nice? And I don't know how successful they were. A lot of these initiatives, as a sociologist, I'd like to go back and do an evaluation. I'd like to study it and see how long-lasting were these changes. But it's a very intriguing to me initiative to capitalize on that window of opportunity. Women, of course, are moving more into formal positions as recovery workers. Women are asking for and actually demanding opportunities to get that relief monies that come in so often are used to reinforce differences, which often become reinforcing inequalities. So they wanted training in non-traditional work. She's learning how to make small toys, as I recall, rather than being given craft kits and doing embroidery work. And there's nothing at all wrong with embroidery work. The question is, do we do the same thing for everybody, or do we have some options so that people, women and men, can develop in different ways? Similarly here, you have more women doing, this is a Habitat for Humanity picture, bringing in older women who some people might think would not use an electric drill, but actually, hark, a number of us probably can, right? And again, back to the question of land rights, this was one of the major steps of difference that's been made recently after the tsunami, and you'll see it again in Japan, I think, too. So that houses that were reconstructed with external aid are no longer given in the name of one partner only, which is usually the man, right? So by initiative, the government said, you shall not, if you're going to bring relief into Indonesia, this is what's going to happen. That deed will be written in her name and in his name. Can you imagine what an impact that made on everybody? And there's some wonderful statements about it, so she's pretty proud. And then some neat initiatives. This came from Sri Lanka that built on faith-based traditions. These are Buddhist women in a gender-responsive, gender-sensitive, Buddhist-based recovery kind of training program. There were young women who were lifted out of villages and put through a short but I hope effective training program, and then they went back to be recovery workers in their own community, building again on faith values. There's nothing as destructive as the external aid assistance that comes and imposes somebody's set of values on a local community when they've lost so much. Women building back with solar power. We could talk more about kind of sustainable redevelopment in that sense. Working in community-based organizations like from the Philippines that have always been more responsive to women and men working together. But you don't often see pictures that have a pretty balanced group of women and men. And women, of course, do the hard recovery work of asking for assistance, and we're on both sides of the table, right? We're providing assistance and we're asking for assistance. And the people who are asking and providing both have the same array of demands and challenges on their time, because usually both lost their houses. Both of them are dealing with losses. This is a neat picture of the woman on the right. Again, going back to Banda Aceh for a moment, she's the first woman vice mayor of the city of Banda Aceh ever, and under her tenure, it was the first ever in the Islamic world charter of women's human rights that came out after that in Indonesia, guaranteeing women the right of freedom of marriage, for example, right? So a huge step forward for women that was possible. In this picture, I'm sure you're aware of what's happening in Haiti and the enormous loss there, including the loss of all of the women who were the major kind of shining lights of anti-violence work. And when the government came in and did a post-disaster needs assessment, right, World Bank and the government got together, there was virtually no mention of women and children in the entire, women and girls in the entire document. Just a little, like, throwaway phrases like the community and women, right? But not a fully developed analysis of how a society as complex as Haiti, or any society, right, really needs to take steps forward, what would help and what wouldn't. So these are the women in the Haitian diaspora, 40-some organizations in the United States, up and down the coast, and Canadian women too, who were from Haiti, got together in a wonderful initiative. First was called the Feminist International Solidarity Camp, and then it became the Haiti Gender Equality Collective. You may have seen they now have published a Haitian Gender Equality Shadow Report. They wrote the report in their whole name. They wrote the report that the World Bank should have written and didn't. Documenting women's stories, women asking the stories and women telling their stories, and bringing men into the work of gender mainstreaming and disaster risk reduction. I totally love this guy checking out the pocketbook here. She's trying to figure out what exactly does it mean when women are always carrying these bags. But these are fellows from Sri Lanka, from Chennai, India, in a program run by a really good friend of mine whose main interest also is looking at third gender people as well. Try and see, when we talk about gender, can we begin to understand that there's not always a binary, that sexualities matter, that there's a space for people who have foot in many different camps, and they are so excluded, so marginalized. So one of her main things is to bring men into our work, but also with a sensitivity to people who don't claim identities either as male or female, but are, like all of us, complex people. So now, having spoken already too much, I'm going to just leave this slide here and note that we need a much longer conversation about men. I think I made some of those points because much of the disaster work puts men at greater risk because of this notion of being manly, right? We could talk forever about that. There's also a gender-based power that accrues to men, again, because of this notion of being manly. So it's a complex kind of conversation. What can be done? I have a number of principles of engagement. 2 minutes? Yeah? Two, maybe one. Yeah. I won't read these out, but just I think you can see that there are basic kind of building blocks, I would say, toward a more effective, sustainable, meaningful recovery that builds in women. So listen, care, empower, develop those capacities, plan ahead so that when we have community meetings or outreach consultations, women are not just counted as present, but actually the concerns that you might want to bring up are actually heard and acted upon. To formalize some of those leadership roles instead of relying always on voluntary roles and saying, yeah, the women will come, sure, no worries, they'll be there, and women will be there, but honest to Pete, there's an awful lot on your plate, right? So they're concerned internationally, and I think we need to look at it in affluent countries too, about really overburdening women without rewarding and acknowledging their contribution to recovery. You can see that some of these other ideas are pretty straightforward. That a lot of these losses to, for example, women's organizations can be anticipated, can be prevented. There need to be some dedicated lines of funding in advance so we don't always play catch up afterwards. And that last point again is important. We need to do our work with and for and on behalf of the men and boys in our lives as well. So women do build disaster resilience in these and many other ways, and our conversation today has really only been about that last point about recovery. But I do love her smile and the notion of moving from people who are seen, just to backtrack again, as so fearful, so incapacitated, so useless in a disaster, or so like over there later dear, to women who are central and can help themselves and their communities survive. So this is what we have to do. This is my other favorite slide. We have to use what we've learned from you all. We have to use those planning tools. If we had more kind of a policy discussion, I would walk you through probably 15 really good gender-sensitive checklists and training guides and policy documents about exactly what we've been talking about. And they sit on the shelf, right? So the challenge to us is to figure out how to really use those and to use this window of opportunity, this horrific loss, all the pain that we have gone through, all of us around the world, to use it to advantage, to build a better future, because we're all on the same page there. We want a future that we will face strongly, bravely, courageously, but in a way that is empowering to all of us and not disempowering to any of us, or we can't talk about resilience. So with that, I end my kind of formal conversation and really welcome your thoughts and your ideas. I think I left you a few minutes. And we'll be around.
A few more than that.
We'll be around for the day. So,
yeah.
What do you think? What was it like here? What would you add to this story that I've told? I think I want to speak about this.
Well, I think one of the challenges is that did you want to
So because of, I think largely because of the command and control structure, when the balloon goes up, everything tightens up, and and the structure sort of comes to life. The machine rolls into town, and there's not a lot of space there to be able to say, look, this is what we know about ourselves. These are the things that matter to us. These are the directions we were heading in. It's sort of there's a big disconnect, and it's very well intentioned. It's not. But that's one of the challenges, is being able to actually get recognition for that local voice. Almost irrespective of its gender in the first instance, but certainly then immediately after that, being able to point out the difference.
Because in that community knowledge, there is a gender-specific component, layers of knowledge, right? Because people have drawn different strengths, right? I think what you're pointing to also is the problem with this disaster cycle that we have in our minds. Like, there's preparedness is here, and there's response, and then there's recovery, and then it wraps right around to. Well, actually not. They're all kind of a mishmash, and I think you'll see in the next 10 or 15 years disaster students throwing out that notion of a disaster cycle. Because what you're talking about is preparedness and resilience building, right? And there's absolutely no reason why it should come after or at the same time or in contradiction at all to the trucks rolling in, because we need the trucks as well, obviously, yeah, right. But that's seen as something different and elsewhere, and a different phase of the cycle. So it will be part of a different budget. It will be a different set of activities in an agency's planning. Needn't be that way, right? It should start there. So that dialogue would not come after, be pushed to the side. It would be the primary thing, and people coming in would go, of course, to the communities, because communities would be at the Emergency Operations Center. There are some positive examples of that, of men and women in immigrant communities coming together in California after a major earthquake, and they now have a seat on the major planning, the emergency planning committees, like the government officials, and they sit in the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center. They're physically there. So that's another model that might be worth exploring.